Welcome to this last lecture on circular economy. This would be a lecture dedicated to criticisms on circular economy. If I taught you actually thermodynamics or organic chemistry, I cannot introduce the principles, reaction mechanisms in the first lecture and then come back in the last lecture and say that, oh, these are my criticisms on the reaction mechanisms. It's not possible because, those are objectively evaluated, experimentally verified, and then proven with data. Whereas on circular economy, you can have various different opinions. There are various different criticisms because it's an emerging field. And the idea of introducing criticisms on circular economy as a separate module in itself is that you should be open to seeing the world differently. You should be able to critically evaluate the content that I have presented thus far, and then also take into account what other scholars from different disciplines say about circular economy. And then you have to be able to make a judgment for yourself. So let's go into the criticisms on circular economy. So these would be the lines of attacks or criticisms on circular economy. The first one is the very famous 2LT, the second law of thermodynamics line of criticism. Professor Marcus Reuter, who was one of the important co-authors of UN Environmental Panel report on recycling, has often employed this line of criticism on circular economy. Then we will talk briefly about rebound effect and Jevons paradox and what they mean. And I'll introduce you to a very important and interesting paper that got published in Nature Sustainability on what I call as the indicator problematic. We will do a specific case study on a circular business model that was done on Swedish apparels by a group of researchers, and we will see what their conclusions are. And then also get into this debate on IPAT equation a little bit. And the last one, I really throw it open to you guys, so you have to figure it out by yourself. Professor Reuter, in one of his manuscripts, begins with this particular line. However, when translating this significant message to images, that is the message of circular economy into images, it is striking that the key extractive industry is not depicted in the Ellen MacArthur depiction and neither in the EU depiction of a circular economy. Essentially, it is this metallurgical view of circular economy. That is, you do not have a really perfect cycle of completely closed loop, but in every single processes, according to the second law of thermodynamics, you always have irreversible losses. That is either of material, matter, or of energy, okay? And you have ever increasing entropy. And this notion of perfectly closed loop that is put forward by CE proponents, according to Professor Reuter, really falls under the material-centric nature of discussions. What is material-centric? We have already discussed about material-centric versus product-centric in the recycling lecture. You might want to go back and see what that actually means. Essentially, what he is arguing is that the modern products are having quote-unquote complex mineralogies. That is, a modern product is made up of multiple different alloys, and all these alloys consist of various different metals and different compositions and microstructure. Okay, and they use increasingly very small amount of very critical metals. So the important valuable critical metals are embedded in a really large matrix of complex alloys and metals, and to take out these valuable metals you need to spend infinite amount of matter and energy to recycle them. Does this energy expenditure actually make sense? It's a very important question to ask. So this is why Professor Reuter says that to have a design for environment, to have a sustainable, let's say, view on recycling, it will have to take into account so many different factors. And he is the one who also proposed the broken cycle wheel in relation to lead metallurgy, if you remember the lecture on lead metallurgy and circular economy. So In essence, this is the 2LT line of criticism on circular economy, that they haven't taken into account the complexities in the modern product, and they haven't taken into account basically the fundamental thermodynamics, or second law of thermodynamics, where you will have irreversible losses nevertheless. Okay, moving on, we also have the criticisms of rebound effect. What does it mean? See, circular economy focuses a lot on reducing the environmental impact of a product, right? So we want to produce products with improved efficiencies of processes. We want to use, let's say, less raw materials and to have products which can give us the same kind of functionality. But at the same time, when you have this sort of reducing the environmental impact per product, it can also not result in reducing the overall impact. For instance, if you are going to put out in the market a lot of secondary input along with the primary material, this can have an unintended effect of increased consumption. So essentially what I'm saying is that we are having the traditional primary production of the products, right? Now we are trying to recycle, and the recycled products are also on the market. What if the consumers buy all these things and then have an increased consumption? Then it doesn't really translate into reduction in emissions. And this is one of the concerns of Professor Hoekstra, Professor Wiedmann, who summarized in their footprint important manuscript. Improved technologies that of eco-efficiency alone will not be sufficient to reach this goal. Consumption patterns will need to alter as well. So this is the conclusion that they actually reach. But then the important question is, something that we have to really ask is, just because, let's say, a product's environmental impact is brought down, just because we are creating more sustainable secondary input, does that necessarily mean there is an increase in consumption? In other words, is correlation really causation? Let's say you have a car and your car's fuel efficiency is improved by 10%. You would expect a 10% of reduction in fuel consumption. But let's say only 8% of fuel consumption reduction happens. What does that mean? You have a 2% of lost benefit. And if you translate that into rebound, which is the lost benefit over the total improvement in fuel efficiency, it's 20% of rebound. Okay. Jevons paradox is a very specific case of rebound effect. It is, if you will, rebound effect on steroids. It simply means that you have 100% or greater that of the rebound effect. So for instance, imagine you improve the car's fuel efficiency by 10%, but rather the consumption actually doesn't go down, but the consumption increases, which means you have greater than 100% of rebound. And this specific case is called as Jevons paradox. Okay. And a group of researchers again tried to answer the question, is correlation the same as causation in this particular case? Let's take the case of China. You have an increase in, let's say, energy efficiency. GDP per energy use is increase in energy efficiency is accompanied by actually the increase in energy use as well. So they tried to plot efficiency and compare it with various different phenomena. And what they found was, with improvement in efficiency, it really translates into increased energy use, increased manufacturing, increased urbanization, and it in fact resulted in increased emissions. So this notion of circular economy having reduced impact per product, let's say on a micro level, does it actually necessarily translate into macro level of reducing emissions as a whole? Does absolute things happen when you improve small things in small places? That's really a question to resolve. But the data shows, at least thus far, that increased efficiency is oftentimes, not all the times, many times can be correlated with increased emissions and increased energy use. Okay, this is an important one. Read the title of this manuscript, Environmental Destruction Not Avoided with Sustainable Development Goals. That's really a big one. It's a really important manuscript. So, you know, the UN has the Sustainable Development Goals, and they have indicators to measure the Sustainable Development Goals. So we have talked a lot about circularity indicators in these lectures as well, and I have given you a few examples of circularity indicators. But you have to be cautious in the use of indicators, okay? Just because the indicators are showing better performance, that doesn't immediately translate into less pressure on the environment. And that's what these people intended to show, or that's what happened at the end of the day when they tried to run this experiment. What they did was they wanted to see if, improvement in these SDG indicators, environmental related indicators, actually translate into progress towards biodiversity conservation. So if you have better numbers on these indicators, does it necessarily mean that we have better biodiversity conservation, is the question they asked. And they found the answers are not very positive, because they found that there is actually very little correlation between the Sustainability Development Goals indicators and the actual reality of biodiversity, because we know that biodiversity has progressively worsened with a lot of extinction of species, right? And there is very little correlation on the first place, and even the correlation that exists is actually negative. That is, if you improve on the numbers proposed by UN, you are actually worsening the biodiversity conservation in many cases. On the contrary, if a country improves on socioeconomic status and if that gets better, then that's positively correlated with the Sustainable Development Goal indicators. So what does this mean? It simply means that the indicators that we have proposed for sustainability is not actually reflecting in, let's say, biodiversity protection, which is an important part of the sustainability. So how we design these indicators, how we measure these indicators, and how close they are to the actual reality that we want to improve is something debatable and something questionable, and that is something that we have to constantly improve. How do we take into account multitudes of factors, various different planetary boundaries, and then incorporate them into making a proper indicator? That is a really important part of the process as well. So just because you see an indicator and you see it's better, doesn't mean everything is okay. You have to really be careful and then measure everything quite carefully, and also design indicators really judiciously and carefully. Okay, let's go into a case study. This is also a criticism that is laid often on circular economy. It's basically greenwashing. So what this case study did was an important article. You could read the article in the link that is in the PowerPoint, or I will upload the article to the UV. They did a case study on circular business models on this Swedish apparel industry. It's called as the TBS systems, a take-back system. So if you buy clothes from some outlets, and when you have used it, you can actually give it back to them or deposit back on some sort of box, and then you can have, let's say you'll have €5 voucher, which you can again use in the shop and so on. Okay, so that's the case of TBS. And they want to see if these things are actually functioning as a true circular business economy, because this was proposed by many industries, apparel industries, and they say that this is how they translate from the linear model that they have into circular business models in the future. And the TBS are really an essential part of the puzzle in their opinion. But the researchers wanted to test this question, and then they asked a few questions. So the first thing is, how are these activities, that is TBS, integrated with other key activities, that is the other part of profit-making machinery inside these industries? So that's a really important question they asked, and then they found a few answers. So first thing they found was what's called as decoupling by outsourcing. So what actually happens is that you take these clothes, you deposit them in the boxes, and at that point of time, at the collection point of end, the responsibility of the industry actually ends. So what they actually do is that they give these clothes to an external party, an external stakeholder, who then takes these clothes and actually charges the company for taking these clothes, and then they deal with it. The question there is, oftentimes these garments are not recycled because you don't have a really active recycling sector, at least in Sweden, for the garments. Oftentimes they are shipped away, And in shipping away, you have a lot of concerns with regards to the labor conditions outside EU and so on. Okay, so that's one thing that is often being done, decoupling by outsourcing. And then you have also what's called as decoupling by internal separation. That is, sometimes you do have these things taken back, and these clothes are at times being resold inside these apparel industries as well. But they are not, let's say, the primary way through which these companies actually generate value. Because the value generation, the primary way of value generation still remains linear, and that is at the core of these business models. These things with the take-back systems, oftentimes they accrue losses, and these losses are more or less acceptable because they do have a linear value generation model at its core. And more often than not, the companies are forced to do these things because of regulations and let's say legislations like extended producer responsibility. So the EPR and stuff forces these companies to take up initiatives, and the conclusion of this particular manuscript is that oftentimes these initiatives are mere PR campaigns, and they do not result in the businesses translating completely into circular business models, but to have a facade of a CBM and then actually do the business as usual. So that is the data that they actually found through this case study. So there is a lot more to this case study. A lot of different questions were asked. I'll post the link, and then you have to actually go through this link to know all the details. Okay, this is another big debate. See, do you remember the time I told that performance economy people are techno-optimists? That's the only time in the lecture I told my opinion. Most of the times, or all the other times, I only presented facts from the researchers. Okay, but this is really interesting point of debate. So I introduced you the IPAT equation. For those who forgot, it's basically an equation saying that the impact is equal to population times technology times affluence. Basically, some people argue, I would say that those are the techno-optimists. They argue that with radical improvement in technology, with a lot of disruptions, you can actually bring down the impact part. You can reduce the environmental impact. So they focus on the T. Some, like Professor Steinberger, focus on the A. That is the affluence part. Her argument is that, look, with increase in affluence, you have increase in consumption. And with increase in consumption, you have increase in emissions and all other environmental impact. For instance, increase in material footprint. This is something that we have already seen. So that's the argument from the group of Professor Steinberger and other people around. And some people focus on the P part, the population. They say that with increase in population, you will have a lot of pressure on the environment. To which the people who argue that affluence is more important respond that the top 10% of the rich in the world actually contribute to almost half of the lifestyle emissions based on the consumption numbers, whereas the bottom 50% don't contribute much, it's just 10%. So how can the P part be more important, but we have to focus on the affluence part? We have to somehow bring down the affluence or reduce the consumption that is driven by affluence. So this is the argument presented by the affluence side. So which one is more important? Affluence, technology, or the population, or a combination of all three in myriads of ways? That's a debate that you have to resolve yourself by reading all the facts. Okay, then the next line of criticism is on the policy side. People who legislate or people who observe circular economy policies, they find that these policies are often in conflict with each other. They find that sometimes you say that you have improved recycling, but that doesn't brought down the primary material demand. Why? You can find an argument for this already in the policy lecture that I presented. The second one is sometimes you want to reduce the GHG emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions, but you do so without caring about other planetary boundaries. there has been observations that the reduction in emissions has been accompanied by a negative impact on land use. And for instance, the legislations which drove improvements in transport sector in EU, such as the cohesion projects, with a lot of improvement in transport sector infrastructure and connection between the member states, you also see simultaneously increase in non-renewable energy consumptions and emissions related to these increase as well. So you have, on one hand, you have betterment of infrastructure. On the other hand, at the same time, this is accompanied by non-renewable energy use. And for instance, the taxation policies that are related to circular economy, they are implemented in very complicated ways. So for instance, the energy directive, which wants to improve the energy efficiency and tax things which are not really renewable, it hasn't worked really great because the central union wants to tax differently than that of the member states, because oftentimes the objective has never been achieved because there is a lot of subsidies or not really a lot of taxes which on fuels which are used for generation of electricity, let's say. So there are on myriads of level circular economy policies conflicting each other, both, let's say, geographically as well as in terms of policy ways. Okay, we are actually in the final slide of this particular lecture and the entire course. The whole of criticisms on circular economy, except a few, can be summarized into simply a debate on growth. So what is growth and what kind of growth do we need as a society? Do we need sustainable growth? Do we need green growth? Or do we need growth in general accompanied by some improvements in sustainability? Or there are a few people who even argue for degrowth, that is a different section of, let's say, debate altogether. What kind of growth or degrowth we want moving forward? There are multiple different opinions on it, and I'm not going to say or present any of them to you, but rather I'm going to point you to some resources, and you have to make up your own mind by reading all these resources. Okay, so this ends the course. I hope you were let's say informed by this course and you are exposed to different sides of the debates on circular economy and also to the fundamental principles of circular economy. And good luck with the exams.